Hello there, and a huge welcome to this week's episode of Enlightened Leadership with Gina Gardiner on Gnostic TV. I am thrilled to have my guest, AliNICOLE, wow, today. She is and has been my mentor for many years. She is an amazing lady. If you want to give her full title, it's Minister, Majesty-Almighty, AliNICOLE, wow. She's the ultimate spiritual multiplicity pioneerpreneur who becomes all things to all, with more than 300 publications on Amazon and over 1,000 online platforms that serve diverse industries. She's an ordained minister, a graduate of 2 Bible universities, cross-trained in over 200 areas, and is a certified spirituality life coach. Welcome, AliNICOLE. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Gina. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you and your listening audience.
We're going to be discussing refining your soul's evolution through spiritual metamorphosis. But before we get to that, just give people a bit of a potted for your story, because it's pretty incredible.
Well, thank you. And yes, I'll try to condense that because it certainly is a pretty massive journey to come into a full expression of who I am as Majesty Almighty. And that is a spiritually divine journey that has led me to this point. Because we're going to be talking today about the refinement, there's a lot of refinement to my journey that trying to explain it in a linear format wouldn't do a lot of service to those who are on the evolutionary edge. And a reason for that is because it's speaking of the caterpillar aspect evolving into the butterfly aspect. So there's a lot of breaking down of that particular journey. But in a nutshell, I found in my journey as I was inching along, I have a background of different Bible degrees, and I have a lot of different diverse levels of my spirituality. So within my journey, there's much, it's very loaded. But what was happening is a lot of my older story was breaking down, and a new narrative was being born for me to not identify with the older aspect of who I was, but to come from the place of what was forming, what was metamorphosizing, because that's where our world is going, and that's the new world that's emerging. So there was a lot of different, I don't say challenges, but it was a beautiful and brutal experience of coming from a certain part of my spirituality that then decomposed to now being a new creation format.
I think many people looking at what's going on or feeling what's going on
Mm-hmm.
recognize that there is something very different about where
Yes.
we are now and where we're going.
Mm-hmm.
We've had many conversations about it's time to let go of the old and even let go of the old new, because
Yes.
something very, very different.
Right.
But before we get into that, I think for many people, one of your most powerful metaphors, and you have many, is about caterpillars and butterflies and true
Mm-hmm.
metamorphosis. And I think when we're talking about a spiritual journey,
Mm-hmm.
that's such a powerful metaphor to use. I'd be really grateful if you could share that with our viewers.
Oh, absolutely. When we go through this human metamorphosis experience, because we're human beings having this spiritual experience, and we can liken it to the other side too. We're spiritual beings having the human experience, right? So when we live these caterpillar lives, even at our best version of ourselves in that form, pales in comparison to what our unique divine encoding is for us to come forth to be the full expression of who we're meant to be. So just like every caterpillar has the encoding to become a butterfly, every caterpillar doesn't become one. Sometimes they expire within that caterpillar life, or they enter into the chrysalis, but they never actually make it through the metamorphosis. So in the human aspect, and that's one of my expanded works is Divine Human Butterflies, I find that within that process, the reason why a lot of people don't reach their full potential, not just in spirituality, but just in general, is because they try to go through the metamorphosis stage in a very transformational way. And that's the way that it's been taught. We learn that that caterpillars transform into butterflies, but I teach it in the way that my journey progressed, that it was very evolutionary, because you become something completely different. It's not like let's say, a tadpole who grows up to become a frog. That's just a bigger version of the same thing. But when we look at the metamorphosis, a caterpillar doesn't become a bigger caterpillar. It becomes a new creation.
Something completely and utterly
different. Yes, something completely different. So when we undergo this new human metamorphosis in a spiritual format, we, of course, are still in our same encasing in terms of our body and physicality.
Human body, yes.
Yes, exactly, the human body. But who we become as an individual, our anatomy starts to shift and starts to change, because we start to unlock this unique divine encoding, which then reformats our way of being into a new expression. And that's what happens within the caterpillar journey, is that it sheds away an old identity, right? It decomposes, and then it emerges and reformats into something new. So because we are spiritual beings and we have a soul, our soul goes through this metamorphosis journey too. It breaks down and becomes more refined, so that we learn who we actually are during this phase of our journey versus where we've been, how people identify even with past lives and different aspects, along that nature, is that a lot of that starts to break down and it's no longer really relevant. So let me just share this, Gina. You know this about me. You're rarely going to hear me talk about anything that is from a previous version of who I am, because of being made new every moment. So when you come into your more metamorphosized experience, if you think about even a butterfly doesn't remember and recall its caterpillar life because it's become something completely different. Now, in the human experience, of course, we have memories of what we once were, but we learn in spiritual evolution to identify more with the new way of being, of who we are, because that's what's true for us. So within the soul's journey, there's content about us. There's archives within our soul, within our DNA. But when you start coming into this newer and truer version of you, a lot of that content is not as relevant as we probably thought it would be for what we perceived that our life purpose was going to be, because that was very much in the caterpillar stage. Because we're entering into a new world, the new world is requiring a new type of not just human experience, but a new type of spiritual evolutionary experience as well.
I think for many people who are listening to this or who are engaged in their own spiritual journey, and if you're watching this or listening to this, then you are going to be someone who is engaged in your own spiritual journey.
Mm-hmm.
Many people get caught up in trying to fit into the mold as was. But my sense check, and certainly we've had a number of conversations about, we're going into completely uncharted territory.
Yeah.
Whilst some of the skills and the resilience and so on that we've learned as we've got to this place, it's a time to look out and to look to be a new version of ourselves, the butterfly version of ourselves.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Where if we still keep looking backwards, then we haven't got the momentum to take us forward to where we need to be.
Absolutely. That's why I'm so glad you said that. That's why when I meet someone who has not been a part of my journey before, I don't typically start with individuals identifying from that version. And there's nothing wrong with that version, but it's just not true. And they're with me in the here and now, and moving evolution forward is that we are in the now and we have new narratives. What happens is sometimes we're so used to identifying with an older version. Most people tend to know themselves in that identity. But when you go through this unique metamorphosis process, you tend to reference that. And again, nothing necessarily wrong with that. It's just it's not a truer version because the soul has evolved. And Gina, most people are at this juncture in their spiritual evolution, their soul's evolution, where they know that it's something more that they're here to be, but because there's not a lot of demonstrations of this new way of being, a lot of people feel very lost and they feel like they're stuck in the middle. That's where the conversation that we're having now can help to clarify, is that people have been in a metamorphosis, but the reason why they can't really form to come into the new creation format is because there's not enough of the shedding away of even what people, as I mentioned before, thought that your life purpose was going to be, thought what your spiritual nature was going to be. You start to identify everything in a very different way, even your perception. So it's hard to identify with that because again, we don't really know. And that's where the refinement comes in, Gina, to kind of illuminate what the soul's content is now so that people can start to adopt and adapt to the new information about them that's coming forward.
There's a lot to unpick there, but there's two or three
Yes.
things I'd like to unpick. And one
Yeah,
is,
definitely.
I think human beings like a sense of certainty,
Yes.
even when that sense of certainty is an illusion. You know,
Yes, that's
we
true.
like that sense that we have control over our
Mhm.
lives. And in reality, we have control over ourselves, how we react to things, what we say, what we do,
Mhm.
how we think, and so on. But I think we are moving at such speed into new surroundings, a
Mhm.
new environment, that one of the things about our spiritual journey, my own included, is the being comfortable with being uncertain.
Yes.
And we had a conversation a couple of weeks ago where, you know, going into a landscape where there are no defining features that we can say, oh, that's that, where if you go that way, then you'll find such and such.
Right.
No signposts because we're into something which is so new.
Mhm.
I mean, I was talking earlier today with somebody who was talking about moving into the age of Aquarius, and things are moving at such a pace. I think for many people, that sense that things are moving and shifting, and things that they could count on before, they can't count on now, leaves people feeling deeply disturbed by, who am I when I'm in this new landscape? How do I operate? What is it I am supposed to do? And the thing that I've learned from you is that this is not about doing, it's about being.
Beingness. Yes.
I'd be grateful if you would speak to beingness, because that
Oh,
seems to be the
absolutely.
differentiation.
Oh, absolutely. And the beingness aspect is really the essence of the butterfly, because if you think about a caterpillar, even in its best life, it's still inching along, right? Can only see head on. So when we look for certainty and we are trying to figure out our lives a certain way, even from a spiritual context, that's a lot of efforting. It's a lot of left brain struggle. So it gets us into more of the doing format, the more the figuring format versus the flow that comes from being truly connected to the source within. When you go through this metamorphosis, that's where the soul gets refined because more of your source way of beingness comes forth. That's where you live from more of that divine way of being, which is a way of being. Source is not efforting. God is not trying to figure things out. It is just a very simplistic format that source flows and communicates. When we operate from more of our source codes, our source way of beingness, then we are in the embodiment of beingness versus doing this. They become one in the same. It's from divine right inspired action taking and beingness versus trying to make something happen and strategize and figure things out. That's very hard for people to understand because there's never been a time in history of mankind where we're at this stage that we have to embody beingness because we've been so used to the doing this aspect.
I think we're wrongly named as a species. I think
Not
we're human doings, not human beings.
even being right.
I know from my own spiritual journey,
Mhm.
that's been really challenging. You know,
Yeah.
I come from a long line of doers, and it's still something on a daily basis, that the being still, the being quiet, getting rid of the white noise and the need to be seen to be actively doing something. I think many people, particularly those who are overtly on their spiritual journey,
Mm-hmm.
want to make a positive difference in the world. You know, one of the things again that we've talked about a lot is the need for speed, because we're already behind. And again,
Yes, in
really
evolution. Mm-hmm.
into that.
Yeah, and it's time to accelerate. And that's why things are accelerating, is because it's time for humanity to catch up with their evolution. And because we are soul beings, spiritual beings here, we have to now come into this evolved way of being so that we can sync up and catapult with the evolution of humanity that is playing out in this spiritual experience. So when we lag behind in our spiritual evolution, our soul's evolution, that is really the lag behind in humanity's evolution as a whole, which explains why so much is the way that it is. Because if you think about it, with all of the different paradigms, whether it's spirituality, whether it's self-help, all of these different paradigms of development that are supposed to, quote unquote, improve who we are, we see that there's still not a lot of progression. And that's the problem. The problem is that there's so much new and improved, but there is no metamorphosis to become something different. And you've heard me talk about this before, where what's happening is that we're manufacturing and building, in a sense, bigger caterpillars, but ultimately never coming into a breakdown, a decomposing, so that a metamorphosis can happen to a new creation. But this is where we are now, Gina, in humanity, where it's almost a forced metamorphosis in a sense, because there was not the willingness to participate in it. So that's where it becomes a little bit brutal. I call it beautiful and brutal. But when we actually adopt this from the soul's perspective and allow the new way to come through, this is where the refinement, and there are more people, Gina, that are on the evolutionary edge than not. A lot of times we think that there's so many that are so far away, and they are, but there's a great majority of individuals who are at the cusp of trying to cross over, but they just haven't known what they're crossing over to, and actually why their journey has been the way it is. But when they can understand it in the simple format in the metamorphosis, is that the uncertainty, the breakdown, the dark nights of the soul, the soul's content, all the inner work that's being done, but it seems like nothing's really happening, all the praying a certain way, but it seems like no shifting's really taking place, is simply because at this juncture, we are not to identify the previous journey with the new. So even not having the understanding or awareness of that, what it is understanding that there is something far beyond what our minds can comprehend. When we start to just lean into that space of that unknown, that's when the new information can come through in terms of what the soul's purpose is now. A lot of times we've been operating out of expired life purposes. And a lot of times what happens is when people feel like they have a calling, or their lives are supposed to go a certain way according to what they think their purposes are supposed to be, what happens is those are stages, those are phases. And so when you reach a certain phase, it's more like looking at an acorn that contains the coating of an oak tree. You go on the journey to crack open that acorn so that the oak tree can begin to emerge. That's the more larger expanded life. But if we continue to do life and do our spiritual journey, our soul's journey in a way that seems very linear and one-dimensional, we don't actually crack open to become the fullness of who we are. That's where the stuckness happens. You've seen it even in business and different spiritual contexts or facilitations that you've seen with others, or you've been a part of with others, where their businesses are stuck, their ministries are stuck, what they felt they were called to is just stuck, and they keep trying to make it happen in a different way. But ultimately, the soul is saying that there's so much more here. Get to the oak tree-ness of who I am. Go through the metamorphosis so you can become the butterfly and beyond. But if you don't, you're going to stay stuck, and ultimately you will never reach your full potential.
I have a theory, and I don't know whether it's a true one, but I think many are struggling with what's defined as mental health because they have reached that place where at some level they know that they're not living their true new purpose, and that there's that sense of dissatisfaction and incompleteness
Mhm.
that almost acts as a canker in terms of spiritual and emotional well-being.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is a very key part, and it's something that I teach. You've probably heard me talk more about this in the empathic aspect, where within the metamorphosis, there is a kind of what is a mental illness, if you will, but it really isn't, but it can be perceived that way, is because it is the breaking down of an old life. So when that old life is breaking down, because we haven't learned how to process it and comprehend what's happening, it definitely is an emotional crisis, because it's an identity crisis. It's a soul crisis, because we don't know how to identify ourselves, and we don't know how to make life work a certain way. What happens when the God you've been praying to, that was so providing and so nurturing, and now you're in this space where there seems to be a nothingness? And this is more likened to when Jesus was on the cross, and God, why have you forsaken me? Because he was in that dark place, but he had to have his own unique metamorphosis during that time so that he could die to the format that he was, and resurrect, what I kind of call the Phoenix Christ awareness, where you resurrect into a new life. That's what our soul is here to do, is to sometimes burn up the old content of what was, even though it just really gets refined and repositioned. You don't really actually lose anything in a sense. It just evolves to its rightful place of purpose in your life for the new life, the new world. But if we don't allow that to happen, then you can have you can stay in a state of what seems to be mental illness, but it is a call to come up higher in a divine awareness, a higher level of consciousness. But if you don't understand that, that's why conversations like these are very important, is to give some context, to give some clarity to what's taking place, so that when you're in that space, you can know how to best take care of yourself. Sometimes, Gina, is some simple herbs that can be taken that can help to shift that awareness, or different levels of work that can be done on the body to help move people beyond that. Because what happens is there's a space of stagnanticity and blocked energy. And again, that's because these codes within us aren't coming alive. They're not being activated because there's not the awareness around it. So life tends to just get worse and worse and worse. And the purpose that people thought they were here for, they're still trying to operate to bring that to pass, is not happening. And when that's not happening, they think, did I get it wrong, God? Did I hear you wrong? What's happening? Nothing is progressing the way that it was. And simply because it's not supposed to. We have to be in that place of surrender. You're not going crazy, even though you can definitely feel like you're going bananas. But just take comfort in understanding that there's more that's evolving within you, and it's being able to, as the Bible talks about, die daily. And sometimes you have to die daily to a certain form. Sometimes what happens, and Gina, you can identify with this, is that you can be called to something, or you feel like your life's going to be going a certain way, and you are meant to do it in that format, but then you can't hold on and be married to that, even if it is a new way. And as you mentioned, something that I talk about, the when the new becomes old, you have to be able to identify that. But because we're so used to grabbing onto something and then wanting to now build a framework around it, is baffling to us when we have to emerge as something, surrender that, let it code up, and then anchor into something else. This is the content of the soul communicating to us that you're so much more than what you know yourself to be. So to refine that means that you have to be able to now see it in its fuller essence, if that makes sense.
It certainly makes sense to me. We've got a few minutes left in the show. When you look at what's going on in the world, there are many people who are feeling a sense of hopelessness and despair.
Yeah.
There is so much war, dissension, and hatred.
Hmm.
And there are many people who think my job is to hold the light. And
Hmm.
yet, against the stream of negative news, it's really difficult. What would you say to them? How are we as light workers or people who are going to illuminate a different way forward? What advice have you got for them?
Well, in order to illuminate the new way forward, we have to become anew. The reason why the light can't shine as brightly, even in a dark world, even by those who are holding the light, is because a lot of them aren't allowing that soul's illumination to come forth, not to any fault of their own. There just is not a lot of teaching around coming into this new way. The encouragement is to be in the space of the new light. Even if you don't know what that's like, it's like building a relationship with a person that you don't know. So you start to connect to this unknown and start to develop a relationship. So then you'll know how to beam and broadcast yourself effectively. You'll know when to be the candle, you'll know when to be the beacon, you'll know when to be a lighthouse or a lamppost, because the light needs to shine accurately. So whatever is coming from your soul's evolution that you're supposed to put out in the world, it has to be the new light that's coming forth, because the old light in the ways that we've done things in leadership simply will not help to transition others into this newer space. That's why most feel hopeless. Even leaders feel their way is lost because they just simply don't know how to bridge that gap. But having the awareness that there's a new illumination that they're being called for, you're going to have to go into your soul and have that refinement journey and start to build a relationship from there.
I know you've got a huge amount of resources to help. I don't know anybody who's got as many books, videos, and programs and so on. So, a couple of questions. One, where can they find you and your resources, what you're offering to help them on their journey?
Oh, absolutely. And we can put links to some of those platforms because there are tons of them within the description. If they visit www.wowshedoesitall.com, it can help to be a bridge to a lot of the work that I do. And they can also visit www.alinicolewow.com. I'll also include my Divine Human Butterfly site, as well. And that can be, linked in the description. This is an important time in human evolution, and I'm certainly looking forward to help be that expanded light, soul refinement during this time.
We're going to put all of those links in the show notes so people can find them very easily. In the last couple of minutes we've got in the show,
Mhm.
is there anything that I've not asked you that you would like to have the opportunity to say to our audience?
Well, I just want to first of all thank you again for being here, and everything that you asked was great, and especially for a setup to introduce individuals to this particular format of their journey because they're at a new juncture. Something that I would like to say is that it's time to live from your true encoding, because that's the only way that you're going to unlock your greatness, and the necessity for refinement of your soul's evolution through this spiritual metamorphosis process. It's vital because there's no other way to live. Like anything, Gina, we go through refinement periods in our lives. It's just that now we're at this stage where the refinement has to come through the metamorphosis, and it's time for people to be the true butterflies of who they are and unlock their greater potential. I know that humanity's ready for that, and everyone that's a part of this experience, that's why they're drawn to this, because it's their time to live from their true encoding.
AliNICOLE, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your experience and your wisdom. And if you've been listening to this, you ultimately are here for the right reason. I say to you, it's time to take action, to take control over your metamorphosis, because you are needed. The world has never needed the illumination of people who have been on that journey and who are being that illumination more than they do now. So
Mm.
thank you very much. Please join me on the next show. You take care now. Bye-bye.